All right, so today we're going to be discussing stress and the impact that it has on both physical and mental health. So, these two statements are maybe extremely obvious, but these are kind of the topics we're going to cover today. So, we're going to talk about, like I just said, the fact that stress has really a lot of negative impacts on our physical and mental health, particularly if we experience chronic stress. So, just a little bit of like normal everyday stress doesn't have that much of an impact, but if you're experiencing really chronic stress, then that can really severely impact our health in a lot of different ways. And then we'll also talk about ways that you can develop healthy coping mechanisms that will help reduce some of those negative impacts so that they're not, as pronounced as they otherwise would be if you didn't have those healthy coping mechanisms. So kind of as usual, start out talking about what exactly is stress. So another, psych concept we've all experienced, but maybe putting it in words isn't necessarily the easiest thing in the world. Stress is really a response that we have whenever our experiences exceed our resources. And when I say resources, I mean that in a really broad way. Those resources could be our mental resources, like our coping skills. It could also be our financial resources, our social support resources. Anytime we experience something that's like, taking too much of those resources, we don't have enough, then that's when we're going to experience stress. And stress is really kind of a process, is a way to think of it as well. So it's this process of evaluating whatever we're encountering and trying to decide if it's negative, if it's positive, does it, outweigh our resources or not. So that process is kind of laid out here in this diagram. So you experience a stressor. So the stressor is the event that causes the stress. And then the first step that we often are going to do is to do what's called primary appraisal. So primary appraisal is basically where you're just deciding, is this thing threatening or is it not? Is it something that's positive? Or is it, threatening in some way? It's been shown people who are able to view things as more of a challenge than a threat, they often experience less stress. So if you encounter something, a difficult exam or your car breaks down or anything we could think of as a stressor, if your mind kind of thinks like, okay, this is a challenge, I'm up to meet this challenge, this is going to help me grow as a person, then that often will not lead to stress. But if instead it's evaluated as a threat, as something negative, then that kind of puts you down this second path here. So if you've decided it's threatening, might lead to harm, it might lead to injury or other negative consequences, then you're going to engage in what's called a secondary appraisal, where you basically try to figure out what your options are and how effective those options are, if they're going to help you overcome whatever this threat is. If you feel like you have some pretty effective options, it will be perceived as a low threat. But if you feel like you don't have really any options available to deal with it, then that's going to be perceived as a high threat, that's where you're going to experience, a higher level of stress. So really stress is, this response is kind of a process of evaluating whenever we encounter something that exceeds our resources. Obviously, we often think of stress as a bad thing, but it really kind of depends on the level of stress that you experience. And this diagram and this concept should look really familiar because it's basically identical to when I talked about arousal and the impact that arousal has on our performance. There's kind of the same idea that, there's an optimal level of stress that's actually good for your performance on a particular task. So let's say, for example, like an exam in a class. If you have zero stress about that exam, then you're probably not going to be very motivated to study or to come to class or to do the things that you need to do to be successful. But if you have just a little bit of stress, like if it worries you and you think, okay, this is really important, it's going to impact my grade, I really need to study, you're probably going to be in this kind of higher level of stress that's going to motivate you to do what you need to do to be successful. If you start to get above that optimal level, though, that's where you can experience the negative side of stress, where it now becomes, like anxiety. It's basically debilitating to your performance at that point. So that kind of lower side of stress, where, it's optimal, it's helping you perform, is often called eustress. So the EU is, I think, like Greek or something for good, basically. And then the higher level, where it's having a negative impact, is referred to as distress. Let's see, what else? So I will say too, stress seems to be something that's like rising, through kind of generations. There's a study or book talks about where they like basically ask people like, has your stress increased or decreased in the last 5 years? And, a huge proportion of people said it had increased in the past 5 years. I think that study was in like 2005 or something, and I would guess it's probably even a larger proportion of people since then that say stress is increasing. So it's becoming, maybe more problematic, which I think we all can think of a million reasons why that would be the case. And it also impacts people differently. So in general, women tend to be more stressed than men. Also, in general, stress tends to kind of peak around midlife, like between 30s and 40s is when most people will be at their highest level of stress. Stress tends to be lowest, probably not surprisingly, for children. So, they don't have a lot of responsibilities, they don't have bills they have to worry about, so stress tends to be pretty low in childhood for most people, and also tends to be really low in like later adulthood. So as people get up into like retirement age, stress also tends to be at a lower level. So there are, kind of like lifetime impacts that affect our stress levels. All right, again, probably a pretty obvious statement, but the things that cause stress tend to be negative events. Again, probably pretty obvious. This is just a list of some of, the things that people often cite as being stressful, and they kind of are in order from like biggest, impact to smallest impact, basically. So, obviously things that are really traumatic, if you have an experience where you feel like your life or your health is threatened, where there's a possibility for injury, those tend to cause the most stress. So any kind of traumatic event obviously is going to lead to pretty large levels of stress. Traumatic events then also can, increase the chances of developing like post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, which now I'm thinking of it, I probably should have had like a whole slide on PTSD because, that's a topic we could spend quite a bit of time talking about. But PTSD is particularly likely if someone experiences multiple traumatic events. So each time a traumatic event is experienced, it kind of increases the risk of PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder, symptoms of that would be basically like, often there's intrusive recall of whatever the event was. So someone who's had a traumatic event and they're suffering from PTSD, they often can't stop themselves from thinking about whatever that traumatic event was. And those memories can often be triggered by things that, to everyone else seems like mundane and normal. So a particular sound or a smell, anything that they associate with that traumatic event, it can trigger those intrusive thoughts and recall. So then that can have all kinds of really negative impacts on their social life. They might avoid going out and doing things because they're trying to avoid those triggering stimuli or having, kind of that reliving that traumatic experience in front of other people. So traumatic events, the worst of these, can lead to PTSD. Is kind of the takeaway from all of that. In addition to that, things like really major life changes. If you're moving to a new city, changing new jobs, if you're going through a divorce or even like getting married or starting a new relationship, having children, having like a death of a loved one would be another pretty obvious big change that might lead to stress. And then, of course, we have our everyday kind of small hassles, like things that are just irritants. There's heavy traffic, you stub your toe on something, you spill coffee on your laptop, all those kind of like minor things that happen throughout the day can trigger stress. The maybe less obvious thing that I could say about that is that those hassles tend to accumulate, though, and they have a really cumulative effect. So if you have, we've all probably had one of those days where it just seems like every little thing is going wrong. And even though nothing major happened, it's like one more minor thing just kind of like sets you over the edge and like, wow, I'm really stressed out now because this little thing just happened. So stress has this really like cumulative effect. And then, a lot of these could happen in a work or school setting, but I also added, there's work and school related stressors that can kind of pile on top of all of those. I'll talk a little bit more about work and school-related stressors later in this lecture. So we'll talk about the concept of burnout, which often tends to happen in school and work settings. So I won't go into too much detail about that right now. Okay, so we kind of talked about what stress is and the things that can cause stress. Now let's look at what actually happens in the body whenever we experience stress. So we've already talked a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is activated anytime we experience anything that's threatening, either minor threatening or majorly threatening. And that sympathetic nervous system, again, like we've already talked about, is going to stimulate lots of different organ systems in the body. It's going to cause our pupils to dilate, our heart rate to increase. We're going to start sweating. Blood flow is going to kind of shift to like our major muscle groups so that we could run or fight if we wanted to. So there's this very physical response that happens whenever we're experiencing stress. And all of that is triggered by a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic nervous system. At the same time, the hypothalamus also communicates with our endocrine system, which is the system that like releases hormones and communicates in lots of ways to the rest of our body as well. So the hypothalamus will also trigger the pituitary gland, which then triggers the adrenal gland. And the adrenal gland will release lots of different hormones in the stress response that have some of those same impacts as the sympathetic nervous system. One thing I will say, so the sympathetic nervous system tends to be very fast. So the hypothalamus communicates to all those peripheral nerves and very quickly kind of activates all those things I talked about. This other system where we're going through the glands, the endocrine system, is a little bit slower and more like sustained and long term. So all that happens, the adrenal gland releases lots of hormones. Two of the main ones are cortisol and norepinephrine. Really, I should call it adrenaline, would be a more accurate name in this context. So adrenaline and norepinephrine, they're chemically the same. It's just adrenaline is when it's a hormone in your body. Norepinephrine is when it's like a neurotransmitter in your brain. So that's why I use that word. But yeah, so cortisol and adrenaline are the two main hormones that are going to be released in this process. Adrenaline is really the hormone that's going to have a lot of the effects I have listed here. So that's what's going to increase your heart rate, increase your respiration. Cortisol is going to basically tell your body to release glucose into your bloodstream. So you have, like fat and stuff stored up in your body. That cortisol basically tells your body like, okay, go ahead and release some of that because we need lots of energy in the bloodstream so that we can fight or, flight or do whatever we need to do. One of the interesting things about this physiological response is that it's going to be pretty much the same regardless of the stressor. So that stressor could be an exam that you're going to take, it could be a bear that you encounter out in the wilderness, it could be a car accident. So even though all those stressors are very different in terms of, their circumstances, their outcomes, our body tends to react pretty much the same way regardless of what the stressor is. This physiological response, you can probably see how it would be very helpful in the short term, especially if there is like a bear or something, I need to run away from it. It's really good that my heart's pounding, that there's oxygen flowing and all of that. But again, if this is chronic and repeated, if you have this stress response, over and over again over a long period of time, then it can have really, really bad effects on the entire body in lots of different ways. So one of the systems that it will have a huge impact on is our immune system. Okay, so to understand how it affects our immune system, let's talk just a little bit about kind of basic things about the immune system. So our immune system is broken into two kind of large, broad parts. There's the innate immune system. So that's the immune system that we're basically born with. And that innate immune system is going to react pretty much the same to any kind of like intrusion or pathogen. So, our skin is actually part of our innate immune system. If you think about it, our skin is like the first barrier that keeps, pathogens and things out. But then also things like the inflammation response and even like the experience of pain, those are part of this innate immune system. So if you get a cut or something, you're going to feel pain pretty much immediately. And that pain triggers, our response of like, okay, this is something that's dangerous. I need to take care of it. I need to clean it up so it doesn't get infected. So pain is even part of that innate immune response. But also inflammation. So inflammation is where you have swelling. There's basically increased blood flow to the area that's been injured. And there are also specific cells that are kind of part of that response that are basically going to go and try to like clean up any debris, try to identify any pathogens that are there, etc. So that's the innate immune system. We also have the adaptive immune system, which is the one that basically like learns specific pathogens and reacts to those specific pathogens in different ways. So if you have, like a virus or a bacteria that gets into your body, the adaptive immune system will find some piece of that virus that it can attack, and it will learn how to attack that thing effectively. And then you will have that immune response probably, for a pretty long period of time, potentially for your entire lifetime. So the adaptive immune system is the one that's utilized by like vaccines, for example. So we get, the COVID vaccine that basically teaches our body how to respond to the COVID virus so that we can fight it off later. So whenever you have chronic stress, through kind of the activation of all those hormones and the physiological response we just talked about, it's often going to trigger this immune system. And if you have repeated chronic stress over time, what can happen is that you will eventually end up with overreaction of the innate immune system. So that, the immune system we're born with will basically go into like overkill, and it's just really sensitive. It'll react to any little thing. So then chronic stress can often lead to chronic inflammation, which has all kinds of repercussions that I could spend, probably a whole lecture talking about. It also can lead to chronic pain. So things like fibromyalgia, or where a person is experiencing even like phantom pains, can result from chronic stress. In addition to that, you have suppression of the adaptive immune system. So the part of our immune system that's really good at fighting off those specific pathogens, things like flu or cold or COVID, that is suppressed. So now you have an increased risk of getting an illness, basically, if you have chronic stress. One of the studies your textbook talks about, they basically took, like 100 participants or whatever, exposed them to the cold virus, and then they tracked them over the course of the next 3 months, and they asked them questions about like what kind of stressful events were happening in their life. And they found the people that experienced lots of stress were much more likely to actually develop a cold than those who did not experience stress. So even though all of them were exposed to the cold virus, it was only the ones who experienced stress that actually developed the illness or symptoms of it. And that's probably because their adaptive immune system was suppressed, so they weren't able to fight off that cold virus. So people who experience chronic stress are going to have a lot more of those acute illnesses over the course of their lifetime. And then in addition to that, chronic stress also sometimes decreases sensitivity to cortisol. So remember, cortisol is the hormone that's released that basically tells our body to release glucose into the bloodstream. It also signals to our cells that they should take up that glucose and use it so that they can, carry out their functions. And so what happens over time, if you have chronic stress, that cortisol is being released over and over again, your body basically decides that it should just ignore it. Like it shouldn't, this cortisol is here all the time, I'm going to just basically start ignoring this. So you have decreased sensitivity. So that can lead to things like chronic fatigue, because your body isn't releasing the glucose and your cells aren't taking them up, so you just feel tired all the time. It can also lead to metabolic disorders, things like diabetes and obesity in some cases, and also cause depression and symptoms of depression. So basically lots of really negative effects on the whole immune system and the body as a whole, basically. It can also impact the cardiovascular system as well. So not just the immune system, but also the cardiovascular system, which is like the heart and all the arteries and things that pump blood through our body. So chronic stress tends to increase our blood pressure, which can result in like cardiovascular disorders, heart disease, things like that. So heart disease is one of the leading causes of death in the US. I think it was knocked down to like number 3 or 4 or something with COVID going on, but there's been various years where it's been like number 1 or number 2 as the, one of the leading causes of death, basically. One of the biggest risk factors for developing heart disease is hypertension, which is basically from increased blood pressure. And so again, if you're having chronic stress that's causing your blood pressure to go up frequently, then that can result in heart disease in the long run. This diagram has some of the symptoms of heart disease, or these are basically symptoms of a heart attack. But if you have heart disease, you might also experience these kind of in lower levels. They are slightly different for males and females. So males tend to have pain in like their chest and kind of like a tightness and a pressure, whereas women tend to have more pain like in their back and their neck when they're experiencing a heart attack. Women also tend to have more like kind of mental symptoms, so anxiety, dizziness, things like that, compared to men. So it's been shown that people who experience all different kinds of stressors are more likely to suffer from hypertension. These are some of the ones that your textbook mentioned that come from, very specific studies that looked at all of these. So things like job strain, if you've lost your job or you're not making enough money, you want to work full-time or you're working part-time, or even if you just have a job that's very stressful, marital conflict, natural disasters, and also discrimination, all have been shown to be associated with increased risk of hypertension. So chronic stress affects our immune system, our cardiovascular system, and it also has effects on a lot of other what are called psychosomatic disorders. So psychosomatic disorder is any disease or illness that is either caused or exacerbated by mental factors. So any kind of disease or whatever that's made worse by mental factors is referred to as a psychosomatic disorder. So things like asthma and allergies, headaches and migraines, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune disorders, and acne and eczema are all considered psychosomatic disorders, again, because all of those basically are made worse if you experience stress. So chronic stress increases the risk of developing these. And then also, like, if you have any of these conditions, then while you're stressed out, the symptoms will basically get worse. Any questions so far about the physical effects of chronic stress?